Celia, it's great being with you here at the conference, the Quest for Consonance, Theology and the Natural Sciences. I've had a long personal history in trying to deal with the relationship between science and religion, but the science I usually focus on are the physical science, particularly cosmology, and the psychological sciences, mind-brain issues. I've avoided evolution, not because of the controversy or scared of it, but because I'm not sure I see how that could yield any deep insights. Now, I know you focused on it, so I want to ask you, if we assume evolution and you believe in God and you have to have evolution producing human beings in the image of God, the Spirit of God, all of that, how does that happen?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm a trained biologist, so questions about biology come most naturally to me in terms of what I'm interested in. And one of the things which I think, when I started thinking about theology and evolution, was the focus has always been on God and evolution, and making those two things compatible. Right. Between, how can you be a theist and also be an evolutionary biologist, which is something that Michael Ruse has talked about as well, Christian Darwinist, if you like. Right. But what I thought hadn't been tackled sufficiently were two aspects. One was Christology. How can you believe in Christ as being divine and human, and also believe in a new evolutionary world? And how can we think about humans being in the image of God, but also believe in this evolutionary narrative? Right. And so those are the two sort of primary questions. And the way I tackled it was actually to try and answer the Christological question first, simply because I think understanding what Imago Dei means, what the image of God means, we come closer to that question if we understand how Christ images God, or is the image of God, rather than just a reflection of the image of God, which is really what Imago Dei really is all about. Right,
so you have the exemplification of the image of God. If you focus on that might be. So yes. You're setting a high bar for yourself by dealing with Christ and evolution in God's image. So that's good. I like high bars. But I'm going to watch carefully to see how you're able to jump them.
Yes. So my first project was Christ and Evolution, when I subtitled Wonder and Wisdom. And in that book, I tried to work out how can we come to a different kind of Christological understanding that still makes sense in the light of evolutionary biology. And so what I wanted to avoid was one common answer for those who have been working in this field of evolution and theology was to say, well, Christ is simply emergent, an emergent religious figure who's particularly unique in his ability to relate to God. To me, that was dissatisfying as a theologian, because it seemed to undercut Christ's divinity. Certainly. And so you're avoiding the sort of Chalcedon definition, which was to say that Christ is both divine and human simultaneously.
Right. Really divine, not metaphorically
fully divine, and rather than just sort of metaphorically divine, as you say. So I tried to find a different way of describing Christ's narrative or time in the world that would somehow resonate with with the evolutionary account, but at the same time say something distinct. And I found through researching in various sources that actually Hans Urs von Balthasar's theodrama was one of the most convincing narratives. And let me explain a little bit more why this is significant. Theodrama is different from a grand narrative because it's dealing with specific periods of history, but it's also combining a story or a narrative in a drama with existential understandings of what it is to be human, and the kind of existential understanding that Hans Urs von Balthasar was speaking about was in Ignatian spirituality. So that combination of Ignatian spirituality with a narrative meant that theodrama was about participating in the actual drama of Christ. So Christ's incarnation, death, life, death, and resurrection is the kernel of the theodramatic process. Now, the reason why this is interesting in relation to evolution is that each stage of the drama includes aspects of contingency but also aspects of determinism, if you like, or a frame of thinking of things where things are sort of moving forward. And in evolutionary accounts, you also get people like Evelyn Hutchinson, for example, talking about the drama of evolution. So the common ground between Christology and evolution, for me, was this dramatic narrative. And so what I tried to do with Hans von Balthasar's work, which is something that no one else had done before, was to expand his notion of theodrama. So the agency wasn't just about Christ's agency, but started to include the agencies of these other creatures in the evolutionary process that then were caught up in the evolutionary story and became part of this theodrama. So there's a theodramatic account, but of course at each stage in that drama you have contingency, but you also have a sense of directedness as well, and so that combination of directedness but also contingency is something that Simon Conway Morris has talked about in his Life Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. And in that particular book, he argues that there is a sort of uncanny convergence of forms in the evolutionary world, and they can't particularly explain precisely why that happens. The sort of limitations of the physical processes of the world, the physics, if you like, isn't sufficient to explain why these convergences seem to happen time and time again. And yet, if you see it now through a lens of theodrama, then that theodrama resonates with the evolutionary story. It's not identical to it. So I see these as a sort of analogies of one another. And there's a kind of mirroring effect so that the two resonate up against one another, but it gives you sort of a way of thinking in a theological way about Christ, while at the same time being, having an evolutionary biological view as well. So
I think it's a fascinating metaphor, but it sounds more like art than science to me. In that, first of all, the convergence of evolution is a controversial concept. I think we all recognize that. It's certainly a position that can be put forth, but it's very controversial among most evolutionary biologists. The point, though, that if you're drawing this parallelism between evolution and the theodrama of the four stages of Christ, that's like an artistic expression, but first of all, that's not contingent. That's supposed to be quite not deterministic in a physical sense, but that's not no contingency there. If there is a God and God planned that's the way it was going to always happen, right?
No, this is where I disagree. I think there's deep
contingency. You think Christ is contingent?
I think that Mary's yes could have been no. Otherwise, she doesn't have pure freedom. So in other words, when Mary was asked by the angel Gabriel, "Will you become the handmaiden of the Lord?" She said, "Do it unto me according to thy word." She could have said, "I don't want to do this according to your word."
You think she really understood what the question was?
I think she didn't understand, but she was prepared to risk it. But it's quite possible that she wouldn't have been prepared to risk it. Otherwise, there's no real human freedom. And the same with Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. He could have said, "No, I'm not going through with this." So in other words, the temptation was a real temptation. It wasn't just a fabricated story that was then imposed on his life after the event. There was something that was really contingent about this, but at the same time, there is this overarching, if you like, it's an improvisation, rather like an orchestra or a jazz player that improvises in order to get the music. And I think there's an improvisation in the way that God deals with the world.
If you assume an improvisation, which is a very powerful point, and you assume contingencies on both sides, contingencies on evolution and contingencies on the development of God's relationship with the world, particularly with Christ, what are the implications of that?
I think the implications are that we don't live in a fixed universe. In other words,
even as far as God's plan is concerned.
Yes, there are different possibilities. I think there isn't such a thing as God's plan. It's a kind of fixed mode, and I think that's a mistake. And I think that's what theology can learn from evolution, if you like. So there's something of a mutual learning process. So we have to listen to the natural world. We have to stand, as it were, with God and look out and see the wisdom in the world as we know it. And this is something that I've thought about as well. In an earlier work I wrote called Creation Through Wisdom, where I argued that the world is created by God, but also it's through wisdom, but in love.